I'm Keziah Thorne, 32, and I've spent my entire adult life turning discarded junk into masterpieces, only to watch my own furniture studio burn to the ground last month. I sat at the end of a conference table that cost more than my first car. The mahogany surface was cold under my fingertips. It was polished to such a high sheen that I could see the dark circles under my eyes reflected in the wood. My hands were trembling, so I clasped them together in my lap to hide the weakness. Across from me, my cousin Marcus checked his Rolex for the third time in 2 minutes. He sighed loudly, a sharp exhale that smelled of espresso and entitlement. Next to him, Beatrice was scrolling through her phone, her acrylic nails clicking against the glass screen like the tapping of an impatient predator. They didn't look at me. They never looked at me. To them, I was the family mistake, the one who chose sandpaper and varnish over stocks and bonds. And now, I was the charity case. The smell of smoke still seemed to cling to my blazer, even though I had dry cleaned it twice. My insurance claim was stuck in bureaucratic purgatory. I had exactly $412 in my checking account. I needed this inheritance. I wasn't greedy, I just wanted to survive. Grandfather had been a hard man, a titan of industry who believed in survival of the fittest, but surely he wouldn't leave his only granddaughter destitute after a tragedy. The heavy oak doors swung open. Mr. Henderson, grandfather's personal attorney for 40 years, shuffled in. He carried a thick leather folder that looked heavy enough to crush a skull. The room went silent. Even Beatrice stopped tapping. Mr. Henderson sat at the head of the table and adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. He didn't make small talk. He opened the folder. The sound of the paper crinkling felt like thunder in the quiet room. To my grandson Marcus, Henderson read, his voice dry as parchment. Marcus leaned forward, his eyes hungry. I leave the sum of $3 million to be paid immediately from the liquid assets of the estate. Marcus let out a breath, a grin spreading across his face that made my stomach turn. He didn't say thank you. He just nodded as if it were simply his due. To my granddaughter, Beatrice, Henderson continued. Beatrice locked her phone and finally looked up. I leave the sum of $3 million, ensuring she maintains the lifestyle to which she has become accustomed. Beatrice squealed, actually squealed. She grabbed Marcus's arm and they shared a look of triumphant greed. My heart hammered against my ribs. $3 million. That kind of money could rebuild my studio 10 times over. It could buy me freedom. It could erase the nightmare of the fire. I held my breath as Mr. Henderson turned his gaze toward me. His expression softened. That was my first warning. Pity is never a good sign in a lawyer's office. And to my granddaughter, Keziah, he said, I dug my fingernails into my palms. I leave the property located at 414 Industrial Way. Silence. I waited for the rest. I waited for the cash amount that would accompany the property. But Mr. Henderson just closed the folder. My ears started to ring. That's it, I whispered, my voice cracking. Marcus let out a short, barking laugh. The textile warehouse. He asked, turning to look at me with mock sympathy. The one that's been condemned since the 90s? It is not condemned, Henderson corrected gently. But it is, in need of attention. It's a rat trap, Beatrice snickered, covering her mouth with her hand. Grandpa left you a literal pile of garbage. I felt the blood drain from my face. 414 Industrial Way. I knew the building. It was a rotting brick carcass on the edge of the city, in a district that the city developers had forgotten decades ago. It was worth less than the taxes I'd have to pay on it. There must be a mistake, I said, standing up. My legs felt like jelly. Grandfather knew I lost everything. He knew about the fire. He knew, Henderson said. He reached into his pocket. He didn't slide a check across the table. He didn't hand me a portfolio of stocks. He slid a single, heavy object across the mahogany. It made a harsh scraping sound that set my teeth on edge. It was a key. It wasn't a modern key. It was old, iron, and rusted, with a head shaped like a clover. Flakes of orange rust dusted the perfect polish of the table. He was very specific, Keziah, Henderson said quietly. He said you are the only one with the vision to see what it's worth. It's worth 0. Marcus shouted, laughing harder now. God, that is classic grandfather. Teaching you a lesson from the grave. Enjoy the rats, Keziah, Beatrice added, standing up and smoothing her designer skirt. Maybe you can make them little furniture sets. The humiliation hit me like a physical blow. My face burned. My chest felt constricted, like a vice was tightening around my lungs. I looked at the check sitting in front of Marcus, then I looked at the rusted piece of metal in front of me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to flip the table, but I didn't. I reached out and grabbed the key. I gripped it so hard the jagged metal bit into the soft flesh of my palm. The pain grounded me. It kept the tears from spilling over. I snatched the deed from under Henderson's hand. Thank you, I choked out, though I didn't mean it. I turned my back on them. I could hear their laughter following me as I walked toward the heavy doors. It sounded like hyenas tearing into a carcass. I pushed the doors open and stepped into the hallway. The cool air of the corridor hit my flushed skin. I walked fast. I needed to get out of there before I collapsed. I looked down at my hand. A single drop of blood squeezed out from where the key had pierced my skin, mixing with the rust. I had nothing, just a burnt-out life and a decaying building that smelled of damp earth and failure. But as I jabbed the elevator button, a strange, dark anger ignited in my gut. They thought this was a joke. They thought I was finished. I squeezed the key again, welcoming the pain. I wasn't going to let them be right. I stood before the massive iron doors of the warehouse, and the silence of the abandoned district rang in my ears like tinnitus. The building was a monolith of red brick that had turned black with decades of grime. It loomed over me, blocking out the weak afternoon sun. The air here was thick, heavy with the scent of stagnant rain and oil that had leaked into the asphalt long ago. My taxi had already sped off, the driver clearly eager to leave this desolate stretch of road. I was alone. I looked down at the rusted clover-headed key in my hand. It felt cold and hostile against my skin. This was my inheritance. This was my $3 million. I stepped forward, my boots splashing into a puddle of murky water that had pooled in the uneven concrete of the loading dock. I reached for the padlock securing the main sliding door. It was a monstrosity of iron, crusted with orange flakes that coated my fingers instantly. I jammed the key into the slot. It wouldn't turn. I gritted my teeth and used both hands, twisting with every ounce of strength I had left. Come on, I hissed, panic rising in my throat. If this key didn't work, I didn't even have the money to call a locksmith. I leaned my shoulder against the cold metal of the door and wrenched the key again. With a groan that sounded like a dying animal, the internal mechanism gave way. The shackle popped open. I pulled the heavy chain free and let it drop. It hit the concrete with a dull, wet thud. I grabbed the handle of the sliding door. It was freezing. I pulled. Nothing happened. I dug my heels into the cracked ground and pulled harder, screaming with the effort. The door shrieked. It was a high, piercing sound of metal grinding on rusted tracks that vibrated through my bones. Slowly, agonizingly, it rolled back. A gust of air rushed out to meet me. It didn't smell like opportunity. It smelled like a tomb. I coughed, waving my hand in front of my face as dust motes danced in the sudden shaft of light. I stepped across the threshold. The space was cavernous. It was bigger than I had imagined, but that only meant there was more of it to rot. Broken skylights far above let in jagged beams of gray light that illuminated the disaster waiting for me. Piles of rotting timber were stacked haphazardly against the far wall, covered in a fuzzy blanket of black mold. Shredded insulation hung from the ceiling rafters like the entrails of the building, swaying slightly in the draft. I took a step forward. Crunch. The sound of breaking glass under my boot was deafening in the stillness. I looked down. The floor was a mosaic of shattered windows, bird droppings, and unidentifiable debris. I walked deeper into the shadows, my heart sinking lower with every step. "Grandfather," I whispered, my voice trembling. "What did you do?" He said I had vision. He said I could see what this was worth. I spun around, looking for anything, a safe, a stack of lumber, a vintage machine, anything of value. But there was nothing, just emptiness and decay. A rat scurried along a rusty pipe running along the wall, its claws clicking rapidly before it vanished into a hole in the plaster. Beatrice was right. It was a rat trap. The realization hit me so hard my knees buckled. This wasn't a challenge. It wasn't a hidden test of character. It was a graveyard for my last remaining hope. I had thought foolishly that maybe the building was just dusty, that maybe the bones were good. But as I looked at the water stains streaking down the brick walls like tears, I saw structural damage. I saw a roof that needed replacing. I saw electrical wiring that had probably been stripped by copper thieves years ago. This building wasn't an asset. It was a liability that would drown me. I stumbled toward a thick concrete pillar in the center of the room. It was damp to the touch, sweating moisture from the humid air. I leaned my back against it, sliding down until I hit the filthy floor. I didn't care about my clothes anymore. I didn't care about the dirt. The dam inside me finally broke. I let out a sob. It was a raw, ugly sound that ripped from my chest. The echo was immediate and mocking. My cry bounced off the metal rafters and the brick walls, repeating itself over and over in the vast emptiness. It sounded like there were a dozen broken versions of me crying in the dark. I pulled my knees to my chest and buried my face in my hands. The smell of smoke from my burnt studio suddenly filled my memory, mixing with the smell of mold in the warehouse. I was suffocating. The weight of my bankruptcy felt like a physical pressure on my sternum, crushing the air out of my lungs. I had no money to fix this. I had no home to go back to. I was sitting in the middle of a rotting carcass, clutching a rusty key while my cousins were likely ordering champagne. "Why?" I screamed into the silence. The word hung in the air unanswered. I squeezed my eyes shut, feeling the hot tears track through the dust on my cheeks. I stayed there for a long time, listening to the drip of water from a leaky pipe somewhere in the darkness. It was a rhythmic, maddening sound. Drip, drip, drip. It sounded like a clock counting down the seconds until I completely fell apart. I wiped the grit from my face with the back of my hand, smearing the tears into a gray paste. Suddenly, the shadows around me were obliterated. Blinding white beams of light sliced through the grime of the warehouse windows. They swept across the floor like prison searchlights, illuminating the dust motes in the air. I shielded my eyes, blinking rapidly against the glare. The low, powerful hum of an engine vibrated through the concrete floor beneath my boots. I heard tires crunching over the broken glass and debris outside. It was the sound of money. I scrambled to my feet, my heart hammering against my ribs. I wasn't ready to be seen. I wasn't ready to be pitied. Through the open sliding door, a glossy black SUV rolled to a stop right at the edge of the loading dock. The engine cut. The silence that followed was heavy and expectant. The driver's door opened with a solid, expensive thunk. A figure stepped out, silhouetted against the dying afternoon light. Even in the shadows, I recognized the posture. It was arrogant. It was relaxed. It was my cousin Julian. He walked to the edge of the dock, his Italian leather loafers hovering dangerously close to a puddle of stagnant oil. He peered into the gloom, a smirk already playing on his lips. "Keziah," his voice echoed, smooth and mocking. "You in there? Or did the roof already cave in on you?" My blood instantly began to heat up. I stepped out from behind the pillar. "What are you doing here, Julian?" I asked, my voice raspier than I wanted it to be. He laughed, a short, sharp bark of sound. He stepped over the threshold, wrinkling his nose as the smell of mold hit him. He was wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my entire burnt-down studio. "Checking on the family investments," he said, pulling a pristine white handkerchief from his pocket and dabbing at his nose. "This isn't an investment," I snapped. "It's a joke, ask Marcus." Julian walked deeper into the space, his eyes darting around like lasers. He wasn't looking at the rot. He wasn't looking at the holes in the roof. He was looking through them. He was calculating. "Marcus is an idiot," Julian said dismissively, waving a hand. "He sees a dump, I see a footprint." He stopped in front of a crumbling brick wall. He reached out and touched the damp masonry with a manicured finger. My skin crawled. It felt like a violation. "Do you know what the zoning is for this district now?" he asked, turning his shark-like gaze on me. "Mixed-use residential." He gestured to the cavernous space. "Bulldoze this heap, flatten the ground, put up a 20-story glass tower. Luxury condos with an industrial chic aesthetic." He looked at me with faux sympathy. "I know you're hurting, Keziah. I know you're broke." He reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a checkbook. "I'm here to save you," he said softly. "I'll take this burden off your hands right now." He uncapped a gold pen. $50,000. I stared at him. 50,000. It wouldn't even cover my debts from the fire. It was a crumb thrown to a beggar. "You want to tear it down?" I whispered. "It's a mercy killing, cuz," he said, scribbling on the check. "This place is a cancer. I'm offering to cut it out for you." He ripped the check out and held it toward me. The paper fluttered in the draft. I looked at his smug face. I looked at the way his eyes dismissed the history of the walls around us. He didn't care about grandfather. He didn't care about me. He was a vulture picking at a carcass before the heart had even stopped beating. A sudden, fierce heat exploded in my chest. It wasn't sadness anymore. It was rage. It was a protective, feral instinct that I didn't know I possessed. I looked at the rotting beams above me. This was a dump. It was a disaster, but it was my disaster. "Get out," I said. Julian paused, the check still extended. "Excuse me?" I said. "Get out," I screamed, the sound tearing from my throat and echoing violently off the metal roof. I stepped toward him, my hands balled into fists. "Put that away and get off my property." Julian's smirk faltered. He looked at the check, then back at me, his eyes narrowing. "Don't be stupid, Keziah. You can't afford the taxes on this place for a single month. You'll be destitute in weeks." "Then I'll be destitute," I yelled, advancing on him. "But I won't let you turn this into some soulless glass box for yuppies." I shoved his hand away. The check fluttered to the filthy floor, landing in a pile of bird droppings. Julian looked down at it, his face twisting into a sneer. "You're crazy," he spat. "Grandfather was senile and you're just pathetic. Get out." I pointed a shaking finger toward the door. He adjusted his jacket, smoothing out a non-existent wrinkle. "Fine," he said, his voice ice cold. "Call me when the city condemns the building. The offer goes down to 10,000 then." He turned on his heel and marched back toward the light. I watched him go, my chest heaving. I listened to the heavy door of his SUV slam shut. I watched the red taillights flare as he reversed, then sped away into the dusk. The silence rushed back in, but it felt different now. It wasn't empty, it was vibrating with the energy of my anger. I looked down at the check lying in the dirt. I stomped on it with my boot, grinding it into the muck until it was unrecognizable. I turned back to the warehouse. The shadows seemed longer now, the corners darker. "You're mine," I whispered to the damp walls. "For better or worse, you're mine." I walked back to the pillar where I had been crying. I needed to think, I needed a plan. I leaned against the wall, but this time instead of sliding down, I stayed standing. My hand brushed against the rough brick. It felt loose. I frowned. I pushed against the brick at shoulder height. It shifted. A puff of ancient mortar dust coughed out from the seam. My heart skipped a beat. I pushed harder. The brick didn't just wiggle, it slid backward. It wasn't a brick, it was a latch. I'm Keziah Vance, 27 years old, and I am currently sleeping on a canvas cot inside a rotting building that wants to kill me. The sun had gone down hours ago. The warehouse transformed when the light left. It wasn't just old anymore, it was hostile. The wind picked up outside. It whistled through the cracks in the corrugated metal roof like a choir of dying things. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 20 minutes. I pulled my thin wool blanket tighter around my shoulders. It did nothing against the damp chill seeping up from the concrete. My teeth were starting to chatter. I couldn't sleep. Every shadow looked like a person. Every settling groan of the building sounded like a footstep. I needed a distraction before my anxiety spiraled into a full-blown panic attack. I reached for my backpack. I pulled out the roll of papers I had salvaged from the foreman's office earlier that afternoon. They were brittle. They smelled of ancient tobacco smoke and mildew. I clicked on my heavy-duty flashlight. I clamped the flashlight between my teeth so I could use both hands. I spread the blueprints out on the floor beside my cot. The paper crinkled loudly in the silence. I smoothed out the curled edges with shivering hands. They were the original architectural drawings from 1952. Vance Textile and Logistics. The legend read in elegant, hand-drafted script. I traced the lines of the main hall with a dirty fingernail. I was trying to orient myself. I wanted to feel like I knew this beast. I looked at the drawing, then I looked up at the cavernous room around me. I looked back down, I frowned. The flashlight beam wobbled as my jaw tight. I took the light out of my mouth and held it steady. I started counting. 1, I whispered, shining the beam on the first structural pillar near the entrance. I looked at the map. There was a square marked P1. 2, I said, swinging the light to the next massive concrete column. P2 on the map. I followed the line of pillars down the center of the vast floor. Everything matched up until I got to the loading dock area. My finger stopped moving on the paper. My heart did a strange little flutter. I shone the light on the far wall, the one adjacent to the roll-up metal doors. It was a solid expanse of red brick. It was stained with soot. It was completely unbroken. I looked down at the blueprint again. I squinted, bringing the paper closer to my face. According to the architect who drew this, that wall didn't exist. The lines on the paper showed an open corridor. It was labeled Service Corridor B, access to lower storage. I looked back at the wall. There was no corridor, there was no door. There was just a solid, heavy barrier of masonry that looked like it had been there for 50 years. I stood up. My blanket fell to the dirty floor, but I didn't notice the cold anymore. I walked toward the loading dock. My boots echoed sharply. I held the blueprint up in one hand and the flashlight in the other. I paced the distance. I walked from the last pillar to the brick wall, 12 paces. I checked the scale on the drawing. The distance from the pillar to the corridor entrance should be 22 feet. I stopped. I looked at the wall. Then I looked at the external wall of the building. I did the math in my head. The exterior of the warehouse extended another 10 feet beyond where I was standing. but from the inside, the room simply stopped. There was a 10-foot gap missing from my reality, a 10-foot void that existed on paper but had been erased from the room. I stepped closer to the brickwork. I ran my hand over the mortar. It was rough. It was gritty. But as I moved my hand to the edge where the wall met the floor, I noticed something. The mortar color was slightly different. It was a shade lighter gray than the rest of the building. This wall wasn't original. It was a mask. It was a false face put up to hide something. Service Corridor B, I whispered to myself. Someone had gone to a lot of trouble to make sure Corridor B disappeared. I thought about the loose brick I had found earlier. I thought about the latch. That wasn't just a random hiding spot. It was a trigger. I wasn't standing in an empty warehouse. I was standing inside a puzzle box, and I was standing right in front of the missing piece. The wind howled outside, slamming against the metal siding. But I wasn't scared of the dark anymore. I was terrified of what was behind that wall, and I was absolutely going to tear it down. I'm Keziah Vance, 27 years old, and I am about to tear down the only thing standing between me and the truth. I stood alone in the center of the vast, freezing warehouse. The flashlight beam cut through the swirling dust motes. It stayed fixed on that section of brick wall, the one that wasn't supposed to exist. My breath plumed in the frigid air, coming in short, angry bursts. I looked down at the blueprints one last time. Service Corridor B, the ink was faded, but the line was undeniable. I dropped the papers onto the concrete floor. I didn't need them anymore. I needed heavy artillery. I turned and marched toward the maintenance cage in the far corner. My boots crunched over broken glass and debris. I reached the rusted chain-link fence. I kicked the gate open. It screamed on its hinges, a shrill metal shriek that echoed in the rafters. I scanned the tool rack. Most of the tools were gone, stolen by looters years ago, but they had left the heavy things. They had left the things that were too burdensome to carry. My eyes landed on it, a sledgehammer. It was leaning against a drum of solidified grease. The head was rusted iron, scarred from years of hard labor. The handle was hickory, dark with oil and the sweat of men who were long dead. I reached out and wrapped my fingers around the wood. It was cold. It was solid. I lifted it. The weight pulled at my shoulder socket. It was heavier than I expected. It felt like a weapon. It felt like justice. I dragged it back across the warehouse floor. The metal head scraped against the concrete, making a low, growling sound. I stopped 10 feet from the false wall. I planted my feet wide. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the damp, moldy air. "You're lying to me," I whispered to the bricks. I gripped the handle with both hands. I tested the balance. I thought about Julian's check fluttering into the bird droppings. I thought about his smirk. I thought about the $50,000 that wouldn't even pay off the bank. The rage flared up again, hot and bright. I raised the hammer. I swung with everything I had. Crack. The sound was like a gunshot. The iron head slammed into the center of the wall. The impact vibrated up my arms. It jolted my teeth. It rattled my skull. I stumbled back, gasping. I looked at the wall. A single spiderweb fracture bloomed on the surface of a red brick. That was it, just a scratch. My arms were already trembling. "No," I said. I gritted my teeth. I stepped forward again. I swung again. Thud. Dust puffed out from the mortar. I swung again. Crack. My palms burned against the wood. I swung again. Crash. A chip of brick flew off and hit my cheek. I didn't feel the pain. I only felt the rhythm. Swing. Impact. Shock. Repeat. I lost track of time. I lost track of the cold. Sweat broke out on my forehead. It ran down my back. It stung my eyes. My breath came in ragged, tearing gasps. "Open up," I screamed, punctuating the words with a violent blow. The hammer felt heavier with every swing. My muscles were screaming. My blisters were tearing open, but the wall was weakening. I could feel it. The sound of the impact changed. It wasn't a solid thud anymore. It was becoming hollow. I raised the hammer over my head one last time. I channeled every ounce of my frustration into my shoulders. I brought it down. The head smashed through. The resistance vanished. Momentum carried me forward and I nearly fell into the wall. Bricks tumbled inward. They crashed onto a floor I couldn't see. A cloud of red dust exploded outward, engulfing me. I coughed, waving my hand in front of my face. I dropped the hammer. It clattered to the floor, useless now. I stood there, panting, my chest heaving like a bellows. I wiped the grit from my eyes. I stared at the hole I had made. It was jagged and ugly, about the size of a microwave. I waited for the smell of rot. I waited for the stench of dead rats or stagnant water, but that's not what hit me. A draft of air pushed through the hole, rushing out into the main warehouse. I froze. I inhaled sharply. It smelled rich. It smelled of cedar wood. It smelled of old, dry paper. It smelled like a library, not a grave. My heart hammered against my ribs, louder than the demolition. I reached for my flashlight on the floor. My hand was shaking so badly I almost dropped it. I clicked it on. The beam cut through the settling dust. I stepped closer to the jagged hole. I leaned in. I was afraid to look. I was afraid of what I would find. I pushed the light through the gap. The beam hit the darkness. It didn't hit a back wall immediately. It stretched out. I squinted. I saw a floor. It wasn't concrete. It was parquet wood, laid in a herringbone pattern. I saw the edge of something tall and metal. Rows of them. Shelves. I moved the light to the left. The beam reflected off something glass. I moved the light to the right. I saw boxes, hundreds of boxes. They were stacked floor to ceiling. They were sealed with wax. The darkness inside didn't feel empty. It felt heavy. It felt deliberate. It felt like the air inside had been holding its breath for 50 years, waiting for me to let it out. I pulled back, my mind racing. This wasn't a service corridor. You don't put parquet floors in a service corridor. You don't smell cedar in a storage closet. I looked at the sledgehammer on the floor. I looked back at the hole. I wasn't just looking at a hidden room. I was looking at the reason my grandfather had never sold this place. I grabbed the edge of the broken brick. I didn't care that it sliced my finger. I leaned my forehead against the cold, rough wall. "What did you do, grandfather?" I whispered into the void. The darkness stared back at me. And for the first time since I arrived, the warehouse didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a vault. I'm Keziah Vance, 27 years old, and I just discovered why my family died guarding a rotting warehouse. I stood frozen in the settling dust. My chest was heaving. My hands were raw and bleeding. I gripped the flashlight with white-knuckled intensity. I aimed the beam through the jagged hole I had just smashed into the brickwork. The light cut through the gloom. It bypassed the swirling red dust of the demolition. It hit something reflective. My breath hitched in my throat. It wasn't gold. It wasn't silver bars stacked in a pyramid. It was industrial gray metal, dozens of crates. They were stacked in precise military-style rows. They gleamed under the harsh lead light of my flashlight. They looked untouched. They looked sterile. My heart didn't just hammer, it stopped completely for a second. Then it restarted with a violent thud that echoed in my ears. I couldn't just stand there looking. I had to be inside. I looked at the hole. It was barely 2 feet wide. Jagged teeth of broken brick lined the perimeter. It was dangerous. It was unstable. I didn't care. I tossed the flashlight through the gap. It clattered onto the wooden floor inside, spinning and casting wild shadows against the ceiling. I grabbed the edges of the broken wall. The brick was rough and bit into my palms. I hoisted my left leg up. I shoved my boot through the opening. I wiggled my hips forward. A sharp corner of masonry snagged my jacket. I heard the fabric rip. I felt the scrape of stone against my ribs, hot and stinging. I grit my teeth. I pushed harder. My shoulder jammed against the masonry. Panic flared for a microsecond. The claustrophobia of being stuck between two worlds. I exhaled all the air from my lungs. I made myself small. I shoved forward with my back leg. I tumbled through. I landed hard on my hands and knees. My palms slapped against wood. I stayed there for a moment, gasping for air. I waited for the dust to settle. I waited for the pain in my ribs to subside. Then I realized something. It was quiet, not the hollow, windy quiet of the main warehouse. This was a dead, heavy silence. In the air, I lifted my head and inhaled. The smell of mold was gone. The smell of rat droppings was gone. It was replaced by the intense, spicy scent of cedar. It was overwhelming. It smelled like the inside of a cigar box, but magnified 1,000 times. I crawled toward my flashlight. I snatched it up and stood slowly. I swept the beam around the room. My mouth fell open. It wasn't just a storage closet, it was a sanctuary. The floor was indeed parquet, laid in a meticulous herringbone pattern that must have cost a fortune 50 years ago. The walls were lined floor to ceiling with cedar planking. That explained the smell. It explained the dryness. Cedar absorbs moisture. Cedar repels insects. This room was built to preserve something organic. I turned the light back to the crates. They were everywhere. There must have been 50 of them. They were stamped with serial numbers, but no logos. They were sealed with heavy wax gaskets. I walked toward the nearest stack. My footsteps sounded loud on the wood. I felt like an intruder in a tomb. I reached out and touched the cold metal of the top crate. My finger came away clean. No dust. This room was hermetically sealed. I needed to open it. I needed to know. I looked around for a tool. I had left the sledgehammer in the outer warehouse. I wasn't going back out there. I scanned the shelves along the far wall. There was a small workbench in the corner. It was tidy, obsessively tidy. I walked over to it. There was a singular object resting in the center of the bench, a crowbar, but not a rusted iron crowbar. This was polished steel. It looked surgical. I picked it up. It felt balanced in my hand. I walked back to the crate. My hands were trembling again, not from exertion this time, from anticipation. I wedged the flat edge of the crowbar under the lid of the crate. I pushed down. The wax seal cracked with a sharp snap. The sound was like a pistol shot in the silence. I worked the bar around the edge. Pop, pop, pop. The pressure released. I hooked my fingers under the metal lid. It was heavy. I heaved it upward. It fell back on its hinges with a metallic clang. I shone the flashlight inside. I expected cash. I expected guns. I expected something illegal. I didn't expect color. A riot of color exploded under the beam. Deep, vibrating indigo, blood red, shimmering gold. The crate was packed with rolls of fabric, but not just any fabric. I reached in. I was afraid to touch it with my dirty hands. I wiped my fingers on my jeans. I gently touched the surface of the top roll. It was cool to the touch. It was smoother than water. Rippled under my skin. Silk, but this wasn't modern, machine-made silk. I recognized the weave. I recognized the impossible tightness of the thread count. I grabbed the roll and carefully lifted it out. It was heavy. I unrolled a foot of it. The light caught the pattern woven into the sheen. Subtle, jacquard birds taking flight against a storm of blue. My knees went weak. I stumbled back against the stack of crates. "No way," I whispered. My voice sounded small in the cedar room. I knew this pattern. Every textile historian in the country knew this pattern. I looked at the end of the cardboard tube inside the roll. There was a stamp. The Nightingale Mill, Lot 404, October 1982. The date hit me like a physical blow. The Nightingale Mill burned to the ground in November of 1982. It was the greatest tragedy in the history of our town. The fire had consumed everything. The machinery, the archives, and the entire production run of their legendary Royal Flight collection. It was supposed to be the finest silk ever produced in North America. It was commissioned for royalty. It was insured for millions, and it was all supposed to be ash. I looked around the room, 50 crates if they were all full, if they all held preserved, pristine rolls of the lost nightingale silk. I wasn't looking at fabric. I was looking at the holy grail of the textile world. Collectors would kill for a single yard of this. Museums would bankrupt themselves for a bolt, and I had a room full of it. My grandfather hadn't just hoarded junk. He had stolen the entire inventory of the Nightingale Mill before it burned. Or maybe he saved it, or maybe he started the fire to hide the theft. The questions swirled in my head, dizzying and terrifying. But one thing was clear. I looked at the shimmering blue silk in my hands. This was the leverage I needed. Julian and the bank could take the warehouse. They could take the land, but they didn't know about the room that didn't exist on the blueprints. I gripped the silk tighter. A smile crept onto my face. It started small, then widened until my cheeks hurt. I wasn't broke anymore. I was sitting on a dragon's hoard. I just had to figure out how to get it out of here before the wolves kicked down the front door. I'm Keziah Vance, 27 years old, and I just realized my inheritance wasn't a curse, but a conspiracy. I stared at the blue silk pooling in my lap like trapped water. My pulse was thrumming against the skin of my throat. I couldn't look away from the fabric, but I needed to see more. If this crate was full, then the inventory list in my head was wrong. Everything I knew about my family history was wrong. I leaned back over the open crate. I carefully shifted the top layer of rolls. The heavy cardboard tubes clacked softly against each other. I reached deeper into the dark gap between the second and third rows. I wanted to feel the bottom. I wanted to know how deep this treasure went. My fingertips grazed something different. It wasn't the smooth, cool slip of silk. It wasn't the rough cardboard of a tube. It was textured. It was warm. I frowned. I hooked my fingers around the object. It was wedged tight between two bolts of crimson jacquard. I gave a sharp tug. It came loose with a dry slide. I pulled my hand out of the crate and brought the object under the beam of my flashlight. My breath caught in a sharp, painful gasp. It was a book, bound in cracked, cognac-colored leather. The edges were worn down to the raw hide, but the gold embossing on the cover still caught the light. A.V. Arthur Vance, my grandfather. My hand started to shake so badly I almost dropped it. This wasn't an accounting ledger. I knew his ledgers. They were black, rigid, and impersonal. This was personal. This was private. I ran my thumb over the initials. I sat back on my heels on the parquet floor, ignoring the sharp pain in my knees. I opened the cover. The spine cracked loud in the dead silence of the cedar room. The smell of old paper and ink wafted up, mixing with the spice of the wood. I turned past the blank flyleaf. The first page was covered in handwriting that made my stomach turn over. It was jagged. It was pressed hard into the paper, the ink splotched in places where the pen had lingered too long. It was the handwriting of a desperate man. I moved the flashlight closer, squinting against the glare. October 14th, 1982. I did the math instantly. 3 weeks before the mill burned down, I began to read. The board convened again today. They aren't asking anymore. They are demanding. I could hear his voice in my head, gruff, serious. Julian's father is leading the charge. They don't care about the weave. They don't care about the legacy. They see the Nightingale Mill as a line item to be liquidated. They want to strip the assets and sell the land to the developers for the new highway expansion. I blinked, rereading the line, Julian's father, the man who ran the bank that was currently trying to foreclose on me. The hatred went back generations. I turned the page. The writing got more frantic. October 20th, 1982. They threatened a hostile takeover. They have the votes. They think they can force me out and sell the Royal Flight Collection to pay off the short-term debts. They want to cut up the masterpieces and sell them as scraps to the fashion houses in Paris. I won't let them. My heart was hammering against my ribs. He wasn't crazy. Everyone said he lost his mind in the end, that he became paranoid. But he wasn't paranoid. He was under siege. I flipped forward looking for the end. November 1st, 1982. I have moved the inventory, all of it. The warehouse on the East River is the only place they won't look. I've falsified the structural reports. I bribed the inspector to condemn the foundation. On paper, the warehouse is a liability. It is a rotting carcass that costs more to demolish than the land is worth. I gasped. I looked up at the cedar walls around me. The decaying warehouse. The burden he left me. It was all a lie. It was camouflage. He made the building look like trash so the vultures would fly right past it. I looked back at the page. I will let the mill burn, let them have the ashes, let them have the insurance money. It is the only way to save the work. I felt a tear slide hot down my cheek. He let his reputation burn with the mill. He let everyone think he was a failure. He let the town whisper that Arthur Vance destroyed his own company through negligence. He took the blame to save the silk. I turned to the very last entry. It was dated years later, just a few months before he died. The handwriting was shaky now, weak. I cannot sell it. If I bring it to market, they will know I stole it from the company assets. They will sue for ownership. It must stay hidden until the statute of limitations on the corporate charter expires, or until someone worthy finds it. I stopped breathing. I am leaving the warehouse to Keziah. My name, written in his dying hand. The others see a dump. They see a tax write-off. They see a headache. Keziah is the only one who ever asked me how the loom worked. She is the only one who touched the fabric with reverence. She understands the craft. The tears were falling freely now, dripping onto my jeans. If she is smart enough to see past the rot, she deserves the beauty. If she just sells the building, she gets nothing. But if she looks, if she really looks, she gets everything. I slammed the book shut. I clutched it to my chest, curling around it. A sob ripped out of my throat, echoing in the sealed room. I rocked back and forth. For weeks I had cursed him. I had cursed him for leaving me a pile of bricks and a mountain of debt. I had cursed him for leaving me alone to fight the wolves. But he hadn't left me alone. He had left me a weapon. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew Julian would come for me. He knew the bank would try to take it. And he knew that if I was just like the rest of them, greedy and superficial, I would have sold the place for scrap and never found this room. He bet on me. He bet his entire life's work on the fact that I would care enough to look closer. I wiped my face with the back of my hand. The sadness was evaporating. It was being replaced by something hotter, something sharper, rage, and power. I looked at the crates stacked to the ceiling. Millions of dollars in vintage, irreplaceable silk. Hidden from the men who wanted to destroy it. Hidden from the bank that wanted to crush me. I stood up. My legs were steady now. I tucked the journal into the inside pocket of my jacket, right against my heart. I hear you, grandfather, I whispered to the cedar walls. I wasn't just a broke girl in a warehouse anymore. I was the guardian of the Nightingale hoard, and I was about to make Julian and his bank regret the day they ever underestimated a Vance. I grabbed the crowbar. I needed to see what was in the other crates. I needed to know exactly how much ammunition I had for the war that was coming. I'm Keziah Vance, 27 years old, and I'm currently standing between $1 billion secret and a team of lawyers who want to destroy me. I made one mistake. I got cocky. After finding the silk, I didn't sleep. I spent the next morning ordering high-grade deadbolts and a cellular security system for the warehouse. I put the rush order on my personal credit card. I thought I was being smart. I thought I was protecting my inheritance. I forgot that in a town owned by Julian's family, nothing goes unnoticed. The hardware store manager must have called him, or maybe the permit office flagged the address. It didn't matter how the leak sprung. It only mattered that the sharks smelled blood. 48 hours later, the banging started. It wasn't a polite knock. It was a fist pounding against the corrugated metal of the main bay doors. I froze. I was standing in the main open space of the warehouse. The false wall to the cedar room was closed, thank God. I had pushed the heavy display cabinet back in front of it only 10 minutes ago, but the dust on the floor still showed drag marks. I scrambled to kick a dirty drop cloth over the scratches. The pounding came again. "Miss Vance, we know you're in there." My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I felt the heavy leather journal tucked into the waistband of my jeans, the cold spine pressing against my skin. I couldn't ignore them. If I didn't open the door, they'd call the police. They'd claim I was destroying estate property. I took a deep breath. I wiped the sweat from my upper lip. I walked to the small side door and threw the bolt. The sunlight blinded me for a second. Then the silhouettes resolved into figures. 3 men, one in a cheap windbreaker, 2 in expensive charcoal suits. And behind them, leaning against a black SUV, was Julian. He wasn't smiling. He looked like a hunter who had just cornered a fox. The man in the windbreaker shoved a stack of papers at my chest. "Keziah Vance?" "Yes," I croaked. "You are hereby served temporary restraining order and emergency injunction." I grabbed the papers, my hands trembling. "What is this?" I demanded, finding my voice. One of the suits stepped forward. He didn't look at me. He looked past me into the gloom of the warehouse. "We have received credible intelligence that you are attempting to liquidate assets belonging to the Vance estate," he said. His voice was smooth, oily. "This building belongs to me," I snapped. "I have the deed." "The building, yes," the lawyer said. "The structure, but the contents?" He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "The contents of the warehouse were never itemized in your grandfather's will. Therefore, under the residual clause of the family trust, all chattel, inventory, and personal effects remain the property of the primary estate." My stomach dropped. The primary estate, which was controlled by the board, which was controlled by Julian. "That's insane," I spat. "It's a warehouse full of trash. You people said so yourselves." "Then you won't mind if we verify that," Julian called out from the car. He pushed off the SUV and walked toward me. His shoes crunched on the gravel. "We have a court order to conduct an immediate inventory to prevent spoilage or theft," Julian said, stopping inches from me. "We're coming in, Keziah." I wanted to slam the door in his face, but the process server put a hand on the door frame. "Interfering with a court order is a felony, Miss Vance." I had no choice. I stepped back. They poured into my sanctuary like oil slicking over water. The lawyers pulled out clipboards. They started tapping on their phones, taking photos of the piles of rotting furniture and rusted machinery. I stood in the center of the room, my arms crossed tight over my chest. I was physically shielding the journal hidden under my shirt. I watched them move. They were dissecting my life. "Tag that pile for disposal," the first suit said, pointing to a stack of old looms. "Check those crates for serial numbers," the second one ordered. They were moving deeper into the warehouse. They were moving toward the back wall, toward the display cabinet, toward the drag marks under the drop cloth. My pulse roared in my ears. If they moved that cabinet, they would see the seam. If they saw the seam, they would find the room. If they found the room, they would take the silk. They would take the legacy my grandfather died to save. "What's behind that shelving unit?" Julian asked. He pointed a manicured finger directly at the false wall. Time stopped. I felt the blood drain from my face. "Just structural supports," I lied. "The roof is caving in back there. It's dangerous." Julian looked at me. His eyes were cold, calculating. He didn't believe me. He started walking toward the cabinet. I think we'll take the risk, he said softly. I dug my fingernails into my palms until the skin broke. I needed a distraction. I needed a miracle, or I needed to use the weapon I was hiding against my skin. I gripped the journal through the fabric of my shirt. Grandfather had beaten them in 1982. I had to beat them now. Wait, I said, my voice ringing out loud and sharp in the cavernous space. Julian stopped. He turned to look at me. You don't want to go back there, I said, forcing a terrifying calmness into my voice. And why is that? Julian asked, raising an eyebrow. Because of the asbestos, I lied. The inspector condemned that zone this morning. If you walk back there without hazmat gear, I'll sue you for reckless endangerment on my property. It was a bluff. A massive, desperate bluff. Julian hesitated. He looked at the cabinet. Then he looked at his expensive suit. Then he looked at me. The air between us crackled with static. He was weighing his greed against his self-preservation. I held his gaze, refusing to blink while my heart screamed in my chest. I wasn't just protecting fabric anymore. I was protecting the only future I had left. I'm Keziah Vance, 27 years old, and I am currently running on 3 days of caffeine and pure, unadulterated spite. Julian bought the lie. He bought the asbestos bluff because men like him fear invisible poisons more than they fear destroying a family legacy. He stepped back from the false wall, his nose wrinkling in disgust. 72 hours, he had said, checking his platinum watch. I'll have a hazmat team here on Monday morning to strip the building. Have your personal trash out by then, Keziah. He laid a strip of red danger tape across the doorframe. Then he left. He thought he had given me a weekend to pack my bags. He was wrong. He had given me a head start. As soon as his SUV disappeared around the corner, I grabbed the heavy iron key ring, the one grandfather had mailed to me in that battered envelope, and the leather journal. I locked the warehouse tight. I drove to a 24-hour diner on the edge of town, the kind of place where the coffee tastes like battery acid and nobody asks why you're crying over legal documents at 3 a.m. I spread everything out on the chipped laminate table. My eyes felt like they were filled with sand. My hands shook so badly I spilled coffee on my jeans twice. I didn't care. I opened the journal. I started at page 1. Grandfather was brilliant, but he was also paranoid. He wrote in riddles. He wrote about the nightingale and the cage. I read until the words swam on the page. I read until the sun came up and the diner shift changed. I ordered more coffee. I kept reading. 24 hours passed. I was hallucinating shadows in the corner of my vision. My body ached from sitting in the hard booth, but I couldn't stop. The lawyers said the contents of the warehouse belonged to the primary estate because they weren't listed in the will. Grandfather wouldn't have made that mistake. He was meticulous. He knew they would come for the silk. I flipped to the back of the journal, past the sketches of looms, past the ranting about corporate greed. And then I saw it. Tucked into a pocket glued to the back cover was a folded piece of onion skin paper. It was brittle. It looked like it would disintegrate if I breathed on it wrong. I unfolded it with surgical care. It was a photocopy of a document filed with the county clerk in 1982. My breath hitched in my throat. It wasn't part of the will. It was a separate property filing memorandum of chattel transfer. I scanned the dense legal jargon. Whereas the structure is real property. I skipped down. The contents, inventory, and all movable goods within said structure are hereby designated as the burden of the keeper. My finger traced the line. And there it was, the loophole, the trap he had set 40 years ago. Ownership of all contents, known or unknown, is transferred in perpetuity to the holder of the physical iron master key, serial number 894V, I looked down at the table. Sitting right next to my empty sugar packets was the heavy iron key. I picked it up. I squinted at the shaft. There, almost worn away by time and thumb rubbing, was the stamp. 894V. I wasn't just the owner of the building. I was the owner of every single thread inside it. Possession wasn't just 9/10 of the law. In this specific, twisted case, it was 10/10. I laughed. It was a dry, cracking sound. I looked like a maniac. I hadn't showered in 2 days, my hair was a bird's nest, and I was holding a rusty key like it was the Holy Grail. I paid my bill. I went home and took a 3-minute cold shower. I put on the only blazer I owned. I drove to the city center. The Vance Holdings Tower was a monument to Julian's ego, glass, steel, and intimidation. I walked past the security desk like I owned the place. When the receptionist tried to stop me, I didn't even slow down. "I'm here to see my cousin," I said, my voice steady for the first time in days. I took the elevator to the top floor. The doors slid open. Julian was in a glass-walled conference room surrounded by the same suits who had invaded my warehouse. They were laughing, probably joking about how easy it was to crush me. I pushed open the heavy glass door. The room went silent. Julian looked up, annoyance flashing across his face. "Keziah," he sighed, "I told you Monday. If you're here to beg for a settlement, you're wasting my time." He leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. "Actually," I said, walking toward the massive mahogany table, "I'm here to save you some money." "Is that so?" "The hazmat team," I said, "you can cancel them." Julian smirked. "Finally seeing reason, did you realize you can't afford the cleanup?" "No," I said, "I realized you don't have the right to clean up anything." I reached into my bag. I pulled out the photocopy of the 1982 memorandum. I didn't hand it to him. I slid it across the polished table. It stopped perfectly in front of him. "What is this?" he asked, looking down his nose at the paper. "Read the highlighted paragraph," I said. "Clause 4, Section B." Julian picked up the paper. He adjusted his cuffs. He started to read. I watched his face. I watched the exact moment the arrogance died. His eyes widened. He stopped breathing. His face went from flushed to a sickly, pale gray. He looked up at me, then back at the paper, then at his lawyers. "Is this valid?" he choked out, shoving the paper at the lead attorney. The lawyer scanned it. He frowned. He pulled out his phone, frantically tapping into a legal database. A minute of agonizing silence passed. The only sound was the hum of the air conditioning and the thumping of my own heart. Finally, the lawyer looked up. He looked terrified. "It was filed," the lawyer whispered. 1982. It's an irrevocable instrument of transfer tied to a physical token. Julian looked at me. His eyes dropped to the rusty key sitting on the table in front of me. "You," he stammered, "you have the key." "I do," I said softly. "And according to that document, everything inside that warehouse, every machine, every scrap of paper, and every crate you were so desperate to inventory belongs to me, not the estate, me." I picked up the key. I closed my fist around it. It felt warm. "So," I said, leaning over the table, my voice dropping to a whisper, "if you or your men set one foot inside my building to touch my property, I will have you arrested for grand larceny." Julian was speechless. His mouth opened and closed like a fish on a dock. The shock on his face was better than any check he could have written me. It was pure, unadulterated defeat. "Get out," he whispered. "Gladly," I said. I turned around. My legs felt like jelly, but I forced myself to walk tall. I made it to the elevator before I let out the breath I'd been holding. I leaned against the cool metal wall as the doors closed, shutting out the sight of Julian's ruin. I had won the battle. But as the elevator plummeted toward the lobby, I knew something else. Julian Vance didn't lose gracefully. I had humiliated him in front of his court. He wouldn't just come back for the money now. He would come back for blood. I gripped the key tighter. Let him come. I was ready. I'm Keziah Vance, 28 years old, and I turned a rotting death trap into the most coveted design house on the East Coast. The air in the warehouse doesn't smell like mildew and despair anymore. It smells of fresh espresso, expensive leather, and the distinct, crisp scent of new money. I stood in the center of the showroom floor, the heels of my boots clicking against the polished concrete. Above me, the afternoon sun poured through the massive industrial skylights I had spent my first big check to install. The light hit the centerpiece of the room. It was a wingback chair, but it wasn't just a chair, it was a statement. It was upholstered in the thorn indigo, a silk so dark and rich it looked like a piece of the night sky had been cut out and stitched over the frame. I reached out and ran my palm over the fabric. It was cool to the touch. It rippled under my fingers like water, shifting from deep blue to black with every change in the light. My skin tingled. A year ago, I was shivering in this spot, terrified of a man in a suit who wanted to bulldoze my history. Now that man needs an appointment just to speak to my assistant. I haven't approved one yet. A quiet chime echoed through the space as the front door opened. My floor manager, a sharp-eyed woman named Alina, ushered out a client who was clutching a swatch book like it was a religious text. The client was a senator's wife. She had practically begged me to sell her the bolts I had found in crate 42. I told her no. We don't sell the fabric here. We sell the art. I turned away from the chair and walked toward the back of the showroom. My heart still did a little flutter every time I approached the north wall. It used to be a wall of rotting drywall and lies. Now it was a floor-to-ceiling sheet of reinforced architectural glass. I stopped in front of it. Behind the glass, illuminated by soft, museum-quality track lighting, was the heart of the Thorn Atelier. The looms. Grandfather's original, cast iron looms, restored to their terrifying, mechanical glory. And stacked on the shelves behind them were the remaining bolts of the legacy silk. Gold, crimson, void black, and a green that looked like liquid emeralds. They were safe. They were preserved in a climate-controlled display that doubled as a vault. I pressed my hand against the cool glass. My reflection stared back at me. I looked different. My hair was cut sharp and sleek. My blazer was tailored. The dark circles under my eyes were gone, replaced by the steady, calm gaze of a woman who knows exactly what she is worth. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out. It was a notification from my bank. Wire transfer received, $450,000 commission finalization. I didn't gasp, I didn't cry, I just smiled. The debt that had been strangling my family for a decade wasn't just paid off, it was obliterated. I was free. I looked past my reflection through the glass to the heavy iron key sitting on a velvet pedestal inside the vault. It was the same rusty key I had slammed onto Julian's conference table. It was the key to my cage and the key to my kingdom. Keziah, Elena called out softly from the front desk. The photographer from Architectural Digest is here early. I took a deep breath, my lungs filled with the clean, conditioned air of my empire. Send them in, I said, my voice echoing off the high ceilings. I smoothed the lapel of my jacket. I took one last look at the silk behind the glass. They thought they left me a ruin. They thought they left me to rot. But they forgot one thing. Ruins are just foundations waiting for the right architect. And I had built a fortress.